podcast?
No, we are live. I think.
Oh, okay. So
'cause
still kicking.
I'm looking at this now. Oh, maybe not.
Nah, bro. Yeah, that's right. It says it ended 2 minutes ago.
Refresh. I just went live again.
All right, 1 second. I'm gonna link the video to the second part to this one.
Okay.
They can patch them together after the fact.
Oh, yeah, we can do that too. All right, we're back live. Hopefully, streaming.
Glad I saw it.
Hiccup.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're back.
So,
hey, sorry for that, guys. We're back.
All right. Okay. So, just to kind of recap the last thing. Hopefully, I'm not repeating everything for everybody who's just watching this. Saying, "How we heard this already?" But basically, so Wes, you agreed that kind of direct observation was a concise way to look at that. So, what is it about that's lacking?
Well, the correspondence to reality, right? So what I talked about earlier with I forget his name now, Plantinga's naturalistic argument against evolution. Or evolutionary argument against naturalism. That's the other way around. According to evolution or an evolutionary perspective in that regard, our faculties were developed over time. I won't say designed, but I think that's a better way to say it in that worldview. Developed over time for the purpose of propagating species, not for discerning truth. And so when you make a truth claim, you're stepping beyond the bounds that an evolutionary perspective can provide. And so we can agree that it is true, but on my view, right, we're made in the image of God, whether we acknowledge that or not. So our ability to reason, our ability to rationalize, our ability to communicate these thoughts come from that special aspect of our creation that's unique to all the other animals, right? That's why we don't see, ducks at the pond contemplating life, but we see people sitting in the park feeding ducks and contemplating life, right? There's a different aspect of our existence that is better explained by the Bible, by God being a part of that understanding, and I won't even say a part, foundational to that. Whereas naturalism can't account for truth value, if you will.
Right. Okay. So one, we have no way to gauge the contemplative nature of animals anywhere. We can just say, oh, they're not contemplating anything. And yet, if we look at other, and it needs to be like triggering, but if we look at other primates, right, we can see how other primates, you can do a quick Google search of Robin Williams and Coco or Kiki, I think it was, they communicate via sign language, and you can see that Coco is very contemplative, right, in his sign language conversation with Robin Williams. So that's one thing. So other animals, because we are just animals, other animals, outside of things like that, we have no, like I have pythons around me right now. Are they thinking about stuff? I don't know. To say that they're not seems to be a reach. The other thing you're doing is what you're doing is you're saying naturalism can't explain for this, but my worldview can. But what you're doing is you're making a stipulation, again, based on an undemonstrated standard. And if we go back to what I said before, right? You say you start with the God thing, even though we talked about this, right? But if we flip that over and I say, no, I start with God is not real and the Bible is not true, and naturalism explains it. And yet, if we start from that kind of equal starting point, right? You say yes, I say no.
Okay.
And we move forward from there. Mm-hmm. The naturalist perspective has all of the explanatory power because we can see it all around it. We can test it, right? We are blocked completely. We have no way to demonstrate supernatural causation in any way, shape, or form. We cannot demonstrate supernatural causation. The scientific method doesn't even allow for that. The scientific method only tests the natural world. So all we have are people saying, oh, I feel this, I think this, I believe this. right? But we can't actually demonstrate this in any way. And you're stipulating and adding this entity and saying, look, see, God explains all this stuff. But it doesn't. But
I'm not just saying that. I mean, there's a biblical record that would justify that, right? I mean, you mentioned the scientific method.
right.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the only one, but the credited developer of the scientific method, Francis Bacon.
I mean, it was a Christian. I'm pretty sure it was a Christian.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, the vast majority of the development of science happens in the Christian West. It's not exclusively, right? Where there's Arabic numbers, of course. There's China had the technology of some form of paper centuries before it was in the West. So there were technological developments and other things like that, but they were stifled and for various reasons that we probably don't want to get into. But if you look at the history of scientific development in the Christian West, the reason that they branched out the way they did, or that it developed, was specifically because that testability idea that you brought up, they believed these things were testable because they believed that the universe was ordered, and they believed it was ordered because there was a God who ordered it. And lo and behold, their test proved consistent. And so while you say you can't test for the supernatural, if you start with the presupposition that there is a God who created all of this, who created you and me, and created us with a desire and ability to know true things about his creation because he's revealed himself in that, then we go out and, oh my goodness, look at that. We have discovered all kinds of things we didn't know before because we believed that. It's not just we knew what needed to be true, we acted like it. And when you get into what the New Testament would refer to as faith, it's trust, right? We acted like that. The reason I'm sitting in this chair, I trusted this chair would hold me, right? And so we move forward in that. And so they're not testing, the validity of whether or not there is a God, but they're testing aspects of the natural world based on the presupposition that there is a God who ordered it such that it can be tested and known.
I think there are still scientists that do that. But to say that scientists do that, no. I would say, yeah, if you work for AIG or ICR, sure you do that because you signed a statement of faith that says you have to do that. But I mean, 93%, I think at the last number that I looked at was 93% of the National Academy of Science are non-believers, right? So, I mean, when you look at the scientific methodology, like, observing, testing, demonstrating, stuff like that, there's nothing in there. There's nothing within the scientific method that let's say God was real, that taking a God out of would change. And if God wasn't real, there's nothing within the scientific method that adding a God to it makes any better.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I don't disagree. Because when you have a tool like science,
it's not superfluous to it.
No, it doesn't make it superfluous because it had to come from somewhere, right? And so scientists today may not be operating with those same presuppositions, but the scientists who established the disciplines that they're able to study today did so specifically because of these theological convictions, right? And so if you take a house and lift it off its foundation, right, you can set it down and it could still serve functionally as a house. You still have rooms. It's not going to be nearly as sturdy, right? But it can still function. There's still a roof. There's still walls, right? And you can still go in and go, it's a perfectly fine house. I don't need a foundation. We wouldn't use that as an argument to change our architecture, right? And so similarly, when you're using tools of science to study the physical world, right, you can still do that. And in fact, it is possible. It is actual, like you say. I'll trust that figure. I don't have any reason to doubt it. The 93%, because there's such a rich history of this testing. But to say because we can do it now without that presupposition, we've never needed that presupposition, is fundamentally false, because we can look at other places throughout history that had different presuppositions. and see that they were not able to develop the scientific enterprise that was developed within the Christian West. But
Can you give
even
me an
then,
example of that? One that
um,
didn't work?
well, I mean, what are the great historical scientists like? What's the Newton of the Far East, or the Newton of the Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or South America?
I have no idea.
Exactly, right? They're not there. They weren't there, or at least we have no reason to believe that they were there, because everything that we have, as far as the history of science, is in the Christian West.
So science works good, and you think that's evidence of God?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the
And
science.
it's ironic that science doesn't have the capacity to demonstrate the thing that helped it get there.
Well, again, it's taking the temperature with a tape measure. You can't use a tool that works in the physical world and use it to measure immaterial or the spiritual.
Exactly. So how do we? Okay, so without a way to measure it, why should we even think it's there? That's what I mean when you say you're multiplying these entities unnecessarily. We can do all this stuff. We don't need a supernatural force behind it. We can explain stuff, and the stuff we can't explain, we don't know yet. There seems to be this great thing, and I'm not going to burden you with it, but I've talked to so many people that they view the term "I don't know" as some type of weakness, right?
Sure.
When Darwin wrote on the origin of species, he didn't know what DNA was. Right? Now we do. Right? So there's lots of stuff we don't know. There's lots of stuff we didn't know 25 years ago. 50 years ago, cancer was a death sentence. Now, the survivability based on the type of cancer you may have could be a decade or more.
Yeah.
Because we know more stuff now. Adding a God to this, it doesn't add anything to it. It doesn't add to the explanatory power. You're trying to add the explanatory power on the back end of it. And saying
I'm doing the exact opposite. I'm showing at the front end of the development of all this science was that presupposition.
Right. At the start of it all. Yeah.
At the start of it all.
Words. We're talking past one another. So at the start, so you're saying, like, when I say at the back end, it's like at the start of it all, there were these presuppositions, and lo and behold, here we are. Right.
Right.
But if you took every science book that has ever been written, this is a little quip by Ricky Gervais. If you burned every science book that's ever been written, 200 years from now, they'd all be exactly the same.
Not necessarily.
And yet, if you burned every holy book, who knows what we come up with? And we can say every science book will be the same because biology's the same, cosmology's the same, botany's the same, astrophysics is the same. We'd learn all of the same things and be able to record it all again. And all of those people that had those foundations, those presuppositions about a God, they're dead. And all the new people in science, after you burned every book, they didn't start with those same presuppositions. And you still have science again.
You can't say that you know that. You can say you believe it again, but you can't say you know it, because we can look historically at all of the civilizations that were out there, and where did the scientific enterprise as we know it come about?
Right, but that itself doesn't matter, because if you took all the books away and started again, it would all end up the same, right?
Okay. So if it's going to end up the same, then you burn all the science books, and those who believe that there is a God who ordered the universe and created us so that we can know it and revealed himself to us through that universe, those are going to be the people who develop the science again in this hypothetical scenario. And we can say that confidently because that's what actually happened in human history. So we can demonstrate that now. That's my point.
Right. So
you see the difference?
A little bit. I don't agree with it, but I see the difference. So Newton, right? I think Newton was a believer, right? Whole gravity thing, all this other stuff. So Newton's dead, destroyed everything from Newton. What about the new books explaining gravity? would be different from what Newton wrote?
Probably the language, right? We've
Oh
developed
yeah,
past
maybe the
Latin.
language, but the substance, right?
Well, okay, so if you're dividing the substance from
Would something still fall to Earth at the same speed?
sure,
Right.
that wouldn't change, but the desire and the confidence that a scientist would have in making the step to observe, hypothesize, test, that's going to come from a metaphysical view.
I'm not sure how you could talk about what someone's desires might be. You don't have access to their private mental thoughts.
Well, okay, so if I don't want to go study the universe, then I'm probably not going to go study the universe.
Right.
Right.
Like, I understand,
so if I'm
I understand that you believe that the people working forward would want to do this, but we can't say the same people with the same desires would come to the same conclusions. We can't. There's no way we could possibly know that. Like if you look at, like if we talk about the whole sciences and stuff, like science, I think if you look at STEMs, right? Was it science, technology,
engineering, mathematics?
Engineering, mathematics, right? So a lot of the science stuff, you know, probably largely Christian based. Engineering, I'm not sure. You know, so pieces coming together, but I don't see how, I really don't see how a God is going to add anything to this, because typically when scientists go into laboratories, right,
Mhm.
you know, observe, test, demonstrate, they don't, there was an interesting article, I forget where it was from, but basically even scientists who have faithful backgrounds will
Mhm.
still try to check that at the door and just look at what does the evidence show me here, right? Not allowing for, you know, a supernatural foot in the door, so to speak. And the reason that they try to do that is because if you allow a supernatural foot in the door to the scientific method, then if something happens or something doesn't happen, then you have this alternative, you know, maybe God doesn't want it to happen this way, or, you know, God's mysterious, or, you know, moves in mysterious ways, or these other
Right.
things, right? And we don't look at what the actual empirical evidence points us to. I'm still failing to see what God adds to this.
Well, I mean, again, it comes to the beliefs of the person that steps out and makes the test, right? And so if to use your analogy, and I remember the Ricky Gervais bit, that was pretty funny actually. But if you burned all the scientific books, right,
Yeah.
the universe would still operate the way it always has, as far as we know, and we know this because, okay, nope, I'm not even going to make that claim.
Oh no,
Right.
you're actually on the right path.
So in order for us to redevelop all that we know about science, there are certain presuppositions we would need to take
Like,
into that enterprise. Number
Okay.
one, that the universe itself is orderly, right? That tomorrow will be like today,
we
and
wouldn't
today
we
is like
wouldn't have
yesterday.
to do that. We'd
Sure
be
we
able to
would.
observe it. We wouldn't have to take a presupposition that we could observe
Okay.
it.
Okay, if you don't presuppose in the consistency of the universe, or the consistency of physical laws, let's say, for example, you don't have any way to know that tomorrow things will behave the same way they did today.
Okay,
We
so
can
now I think
test
I
it
know
today,
okay.
and then we can test it tomorrow. But just because it worked yesterday and it worked today, it doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow unless we're operating under that presupposition of that consistency. Now we can test to validate the presupposition, right? So if we have,
what would be an
and
example of that? How could you test to validate that?
well, I mean, the way, well, I don't want to go over my skis here. It's been a long time since I looked into.
I can give you a hint.
Okay.
The direct observation I talked about with your chair.
Right. Okay. So yeah, direct observation. We can do that. I was thinking like specific experiments. So we can do direct observation, but that again presupposes a mind developed to the end of truth rather than propagating of the species.
So you're slipping developed in there, right? Like you're
Well,
slipping
I'm saying developed
there,
intentionally, not design. Right. Developed, you know, even in an evolutionary perspective. Right. The mind that we have is not the mind that existed in a pre-evolutionary state. Right. You know, the whole, and I know it's a joke, but basically fish to philosophers. When our ancient ancestors were swimming in the rivers, or even single-celled organisms, they didn't have the minds we have today. Can we agree on that?
They don't have the same minds, like volume wise, but they still had brains. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean like single-celled organisms at the very beginning of life.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So on an evolutionary perspective, this mind was developed over time.
Yeah. It evolved. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you would, but I'm not saying it was, on your view, it was done intentionally by an intelligent design or anything like that. That's why I'm using the term develop rather than design. So I'm not trying to smuggle that in. I hope that's.
Yeah. It may have been unfair for me to try to slam me with that. So yeah, I'm carefully retracted.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, so we would have to believe in a mind that evolved over time for
Mhm.
for I don't want to say purpose. I'll say for the ability to ascertain truth rather than propagate the species.
I think that's just a byproduct, right? Um, we couldn't have known, Australopithecus afarensis, right? Lucy
Mhm.
couldn't have maybe it's maybe fair to say that we don't understand why we have the capacity to do what it is that we do. Here we are doing the things that we do, right? But you said it interestingly enough, right? Like, evolving over time, less advanced species and then becoming more advanced species, and the cc's of the brains increasing over time through different primates and so on and so forth, and through mammals and things like that, and here we are. And again, I go back to, what does a God add to that? Like, it's like, we can explain it all.
When you say add to that, what is the that you're referring to?
Like, it doesn't have any explanatory power, Wes.
What doesn't? What's the
God.
it?
God doesn't have any explanatory power.
No, okay. When you say adding God to that, what, like
to us,
Okay.
God doesn't add any explanatory power. You said it yourself, developing over time through the process of evolution. And you want to, and we talked about this earlier. We have the ability to discern truth being the property of sentences. We have the capacity to reason. We can come to true statements. You know that you're sitting in a chair, the reliability of your senses, all these other things. All the stuff, by the way, that I talked about, the presuppositions that I have, right? Reality, right? The fact that we all exist, we agree reality is real. Reason, having the capacity to reason, through the developments in our brain, using logic as a descriptive force, of we see, what's around us and stuff like that. All of these things developing slowly over time to where we are now. And what you're doing is you're inserting, you're saying, like, essentially, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's like all of this stuff because God. And yet,
No, I'm not.
If we don't have God in there, it, like, having God not in the picture doesn't take away from any of this stuff.
Well, okay, so practically speaking, right? You take God away from the original developers of the scientific enterprise in the Christian West.
Yeah.
You have the same stagnation that you see everywhere else in the world.
We can't know what was going to happen. Like, if those people weren't, like, for example, like we talked about mathematics developing in the Middle East, right? Islamic states, I believe. I think it's algebra. I can't remember. Anyway, maths.
At least the Arabic numbers and some application of that.
Right. Their faith system is anathema to yours.
Their what system?
It is an anathema to yours.
The what system is anathema to us?
Their system of beliefs. Like, they were still theists, but in your mind, they're going to the fire.
Well, it's not that it has anything to do with going to the fire. It's fundamentally false, right? And a different understanding of who God is led to different applications in the way of intellectual development.
So how do we know that the Islamic world, left to its own devices, wouldn't have come up with all this other stuff just the same? We can't know that.
Well, we can look at history and say it didn't, right? There's plenty of opportunity, right? They had the Old Testament.
All right. Okay.
There was plenty of revelation that they had available, right? Even Nobel laureates. Robert Jastrow, I think it was, who mentioned in his book, I may be getting them mixed up, but referring to the origin of the universe is exactly what I would expect to see if I had nothing but with the Psalms, the Pentateuch, and the Old Testament as a whole, something like that, right? So I mean,
here's perhaps a better question. So all these people in the Middle East believing all these things,
mm-hmm.
the start of the whole scientific method coming from people who had a faith, firmly believing all this stuff, the designer, all this other stuff. Does that make it true?
Their individual belief or their general belief?
Yeah.
No,
because they
no,
believe
believing something doesn't make it true.
Right.
No, I think we would agree with that, right?
So they could be.
You think me believing in God doesn't make it true, just like I believe your rejection of God doesn't make that true.
Oh no, yeah, it's well, except the Christian God, there's no way that could exist. I accept the fact that there could be a God, but the Bible's too contradictory for that God to exist. But I could be wrong, and I accept the fact that I could be wrong. But so if we peel that stuff away, if we peel away all the beliefs and what the people thought was right, and thought believe in stuff like that, and you just look at the methodology that they developed. All that stuff stands on its own, and adding a God to it doesn't do anything.
Sure it does. Sure it does. So think of it this way: you want to fix a leak in your house, right?
Sure.
But all the tools in your toolbox are for electrical work, right? You don't have the right tools in your toolbox for the job at hand, right? So
that would actually be true of me. I have virtually no tools anyway. I hire people to do stuff.
There you go. Exactly. Or same thing if you had a toolbox full of plumbing tools and you needed to patch a roof, you don't have the right tools, right? With Islam, there's some true things that they would say, right? I'm not one of those folks who would say that if you don't believe exactly the way I believe, then you can't know anything, right? There's some generalities. There's common grace, general revelation that's available to all of us. And so there are things that they understand. So they've got some tools in their toolbox. But when it comes to the development necessary to get where, say, the Christian West got the scientific development, they didn't have the tools in their toolbox. And when you eliminate God, even hypothetically, you're eliminating all the tools that you would need to generate this knowledge again. So when we talk about burning all the science books, nature would still work just fine, right? And from my perspective, God is holding all things and governing all things according to the counsel of his own will, just like he always has, and it is done in such a way as to reveal himself and to be testable in creation. And the early sciences
testable in creation.
Yeah, things that we can know about creation, like he's revealed himself through that, and we can test creation, right? We can measure things. We can, all of the developments of science are out there available to us. And those who are in the Christian West had the toolbox necessary for the job. The Far East didn't have it. Russia didn't have it. Sub-Saharan Africa didn't have it. The Middle East didn't have it. South America and the Americas didn't have it.
Are you suggesting that without people having a belief in a God, science wouldn't have developed?
I'm suggesting that without a belief in the true God and the applications of that science would not have developed the way it did.
Well, I don't know how we could ever know that, but we've been talking about science. Do you want to move on to something else? You want to talk Bible? Do you want to talk like what do you want to? Again, I feel like I've been drilling you a lot, so.
Yeah, it's good. I think at least I like to think. Correct me if I'm wrong. That I'm kind of giving as much as I'm getting in the exchange.
Yeah, it's almost something I try to be self-aware of, that I can, and maybe it comes from a little bit from co-hosting a podcast for a bunch of years and stuff like that, and kind of the difference between guiding a conversation and taking over a conversation. I never like to try to do that. I like to try to be as humble as possible when it comes to the conversation. So whatever it is, you fire the next thing.
All right. So science can fit in that category of truth, but the thing I like to focus on a lot is goodness, right? So moral goodness, ethical goodness, good versus evil, right? This is another failure of a naturalistic worldview, right? There's no accounting for, or there's insufficient accounting for, let me say it that way, the categories of good and evil or of moral imperatives.
Interesting. So, okay. So when you said a minute ago, you said morality and ethics. I almost look at those as synonyms. Do you see them as different?
I do too.
Okay. All right.
I know some people do, so I allow for it on the outset. So if we can talk about them synonymously, I'm good with that.
I pretty much just look at them as synonymous. Okay. So yeah, from my perspective, morality is a social contract. And there has to be, with any contract, there has to be buy-in.
Okay.
Right. You have to give a shit about me and I have to give a shit about you.
Fair way to say it.
And we have lots of examples where this isn't the case, right? Psychopaths, for example, those who actually are devoid of any type of moral intuition at all, that actually gain pleasure from the pain of others.
Sure.
But so my moral foundation is based on, it's tricky. Let me try to lay it out as quickly as I can, as succinctly as possible. The promotion of well-being to the best of our ability, while limiting harm to the best of our ability, and as best we can, limiting or eliminating the involuntary imposition of our will onto other conscious creatures.
Okay. So that would be your understanding of morality. Let me make sure I got this right. A promotion of well-being
to the best of
our and to the best of our understanding. Would it be fair to add that caveat
for example,
as well?
I vaccinated my daughter, right? The injection hurt her, but the best I could do for her was for her to, feel a little needle prick, right? Because, MMR is a really bad thing, right? Yeah. So that was the best I could do, even though it, caused her a little bit of harm.
Yeah, I do recall that being the most painful of the vaccines back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to have that booster shot kind of here, where I have that kind of like cigar-sized punch.
Oh yeah.
There, I remember getting that, and it was like, what the hell was that? But anyway, yeah. So that's one example, right? Like promoting well-being, a little bit of suffering, right?
Okay.
And and again, the involuntary imposition of will to the best of our ability. And it's hard because there are ways that I try and I fail this all the time, right? Bacon's fucking delicious.
It really is.
So
it's proof that there is a God and he loves us.
I'm gonna eat a pig. It's one of the meats that I have the hardest time with because pigs are so intelligent. So we can, but chickens, I'll eat chickens every day. Stupid little animals. I will eat a chicken every day.
Chicken wings.
But that has me falling short, right, from a well-being and imposition of will and stuff like that. And I'm not personally killing the animal, right? I mean, I have a grocery store. I don't do farming. So that's not an issue, for me in that way. But it is something that I struggle with. Like I said, bacon and ribs and all this other stuff, wonderful things, so delicious. But I struggle with that from a moral perspective. So it's not perfect by any stretch. But we can see, and we have seen, how morality has changed over time, right? Once upon a time, it was totally cool to have slaves, right? Whether we're talking about the antebellum South or the Middle East, right? Doesn't matter. It was perfectly cool to have slaves.
Still is in a lot of the world.
It's still, yeah. And I've heard some people argue that, well, if you have a job more for a company, you're a slave. I think that's a load of crap. But a dear friend of mine, who may be in the audience listening, a guy named Josh Bowen, wrote a great book called Does the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Go pick it up if you haven't read it. The short answer is yes, of course it did. But that's a whole nother topic that we can discuss some other time. But, and then we learned stuff, right? We learned that imposition was not a good thing, right? And now slavery, and I'm not talking about indentured servitude. I'm talking about ownership of people, right?
Full
And
on. Yeah.
passing them on as property, right? Like it says in the Bible. So that's the kind of, but we learned how that's not cool, right?
Mhm.
And you can look at all kinds of things. It used to be, I mean, when I was a child, my mother could not obtain credit in her own name. Right? Women, they had to get their husbands to co-sign for it and stuff like that. And we learned, that women are at least equal to us, if not smarter. And so we learned that, these things. And so there's just it's easy to demonstrate that, that morality is a social construct and that it absolutely, evolves over time. And that, there has to be this buy-in, right? You have to care about me, I have to care about you. And all of the things, people talk about, like I quoted in my opening, the moral law written on your heart.
Right.
Unless you're a psychopath, right? I guess that.
Nope. You still have the moral law written on your heart.
Well, interesting. So, okay. So I guess I should say, I understand the metaphor behind it, right? But heart's an organ that pumps blood, right? All of our thinking happens here.
Sure.
And we know that within psychopathy, right? So like yours and my brain are wired like this, and a psychopath's is like this, right? It's broken essentially. Organic brain damage, things like that.
Yeah.
They do not think the same way. And so, I mean, the whole idea of the moral law being written on someone's heart. I've read studies about the psychopaths being interviewed, and they're genuinely dumbfounded. Like, I don't understand what the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to kill. Like, I did what I wanted. I wanted to kill the person, so I did. Why am I here? What's the big deal?
Yeah.
They have the moral law written in their heart, do they?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's part of being made in the image of God. That's the 10 Commandments, which is the law that's written on our heart. It is actually, if you want to go back and look, it is present prior to Exodus 20. Prohibitions to lying, keeping the Sabbath.
Sure.
Prohibitions against murder. The expectation that you should not murder, going all the way back to Cain and Abel. Right. So those kinds of things. That's start to finish.
It's interesting.
But I would
fine.
Go ahead.
I always find the 10 Commandments funny. Christopher Hitchens in one of his talks, he kind of tore him up. He said, basically paraphrased, the first 4 have nothing whatsoever to do with morality. They're all about edicts on basically how not to piss off a god. The only 3 that are used in our law system at all today are murder, theft, and lying. And there are some that are positively relative, right? I happen to personally agree with this. I think there are times when lying is the most moral thing you could possibly do. Mm-hmm. Everybody's heard the analogy of the Nazis at your door, right, in World War II Germany. Yep. To say yes, there are the Jews is the most immoral thing you could possibly do. The only correct moral answer would be, like, in order to promote well-being and reduce harm, would be to lie to the soldiers, right? Anything else would be barbaric.
I don't know that that's true even on your worldview, right? Because at root, it's your own personal well-being.
No, right? Not at all.
I mean, that's certainly part of it, because you're a moral actor in this, right? And if you lie and are caught,
well, I mean, it might be fair to say that if I was the one standing at the door and the Germans, like if I was a German hiding Jews, I don't know what the repercussions were to lying. Probably not good. Might there be a selfish component in that? Maybe. I'd like to hope that I would have the courage of my convictions and regardless do the right thing. Although maybe we can never be sure until we're faced with that situation. The other one that I want to talk about is the whole kind of honoring your father and your mother. Well, does that stand true? Like, should you honor your father and your mother even if they were horribly abusive to you? Do they still deserve your honor?
To a degree, sure. And I'll go ahead and preface this. This is somebody who grew up with a very poor relationship with my own father. And I can say confidently that there are different ways that you can honor your parents, right? It's not simply, for example, obedience, right? Whatever dad says goes, or whatever mom says goes, right? It's not blind obedience in that regard, because we see scriptural evidence that, or at least in a biblical worldview, God is at the top of the authority food chain, right? So if any authority underneath that, whether it's a parent or government, tells you to do something that God forbids, you have the right and the responsibility to neglect that command in service to a higher authority.
Interesting. So I kind of laid out kind of my moral background. I essentially know what yours is, but it might be useful for people that are watching that maybe don't know or aren't familiar with you, for you to lay out yours.
So in short, goodness, moral goodness, is a characteristic, if you will, of the character of God. Right? It's not merely it's right because God says it. It's right because it's consistent with the character and nature of God Himself, and He has revealed it to us in the pages of Scripture, and also written that law on our moral hearts. Now that comes with not simply moral imperatives, but there's a whole host of other things there. Like when you talk about minimizing well-being, for example, we would see
maximizing well-being, minimizing harm.
I'm sorry, maximizing well-being. That's
make me look like a psychopath.
Yeah, no. We would see every individual, whether they're Christians or not, right? So me and you both, as well as Facade and AAA here, made in the image of God, and there's automatic dignity and value that you have by virtue of being made in the image of God. That's different from every animal, right? Even pigs and chimpanzees and everything.
Are you conceding that we're animals?
No. We
I got excited there for a second because you said every animal.
No, we are special.
Real quick, if I could.
Come on.
Be quiet.
Before we go too deep into that, I have a question from the chat.
Come on.
For Wes, and it's regarding our current topic, so I don't want to get too far off the rabbit stream or down the rabbit trail before we change topics again.
Yeah.
It says, Wes, does physical harm have anything to do with why something is morally wrong? If so, then why can't we just measure morality based on those terms? It seems like God would be unnecessary if that's the point.
Well, that's a good question. I would say that physical harm is part of it, but not the totality of morality. So the reason we can't rely simply on physical pain or physical well-being even is a sufficient reason not to base morality purely on that. And I think, Michael, you would agree that mental well-being would be part of that as well.
Mental health? Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think that's a bridge that we can both cross and meet in the middle of. So I would say physical health is certainly an aspect of morality, but not sufficient in and of itself.
I found it interesting a minute ago how you kind of sidestepped the Euthyphro dilemma with what you said.
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah, it was interesting. It almost got by me. But it is interesting, right? Like, I mean, you really, this is a river that you can't fish on both sides of.
Okay.
Like either it is good because God says it's good, or
God says it because it's good.
Yeah. Like which one is it?
So, I mean, the traditional response, as I understand it, is God's character and nature is good, therefore He says it, right? So what He says is consistent with His character and nature. Yeah, so if you wanted to shoehorn it,
sounds like the first horn. That sounds like the first horn.
It's good because He says it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So from an epistemological standpoint, that's kind of where it goes. So if I'm reading the pages of Scripture and God issues a command, right, I can think God said it, therefore it must be good, right? But logically speaking, right, He says it, and that command is in time and space, but that's coming from His character and nature that transcends time and space. So logically, His nature is prior to His command. Does that make sense?
No. because
So-
I don't
so-
know, like I don't know what it means to exist outside of time and space. It did like that seemed
Yeah.
coherent to me.
Yeah.
Like,
no,
what
I
does
mean,
it mean to exist for no time?
well, without getting into the particulars of the word exist, I would prefer to say that God is rather than God exists. And when God creates,
God
right,
exists, right?
right. Well, I mean, all right. So I will step out of that. As a reference, if anybody's looking, there's watching on. There's a fairly short video that R.C. Sproul did called "God Does Not Exist." So if you get a chance to watch that, it's just
No,
5,
stop.
7
We
minutes,
agree.
something like that.
We agree.
Yeah.
No need to look at the video.
But the reason for that is that the word itself, exist, means to stand out of what is, right? And classically speaking, God is the is, right? We exist. We stand out of that. We are constantly changing, right? We get older, hair gets longer. Sometimes we cut it off, right? We
Mine
get
fell out.
wrinkles. Yeah, there you go. So we're constantly in a state of flux, right? I think it's once every, I don't know how many years, 7 years, something like that. Our physical makeup is completely different.
We are our own ship of Theseus. Yeah.
Yeah. So in contrast, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Right? He does not change. So there's an isness to God that we don't possess, just like all of creation. Entropy, things decay over time. Right? So part of being, part of existing is standing outside of that. I'll
That's really interesting. I want to go back to that. Yeah, because the whole
Okay.
idea of entropy, like my experience has been, Christians love the second law of thermodynamics. Do you know what the first law is?
No, I don't have it off the tip of my tongue.
It's that energy can neither be created nor destroyed.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I've posed this. I've never had a real answer. They'll just kind of get balked at. But I've asked the question, like, why is it that energy just can't be the fundamental thing? Why is it energy just couldn't have always existed? Anyway, we don't just put a pin in that.
Yeah.
Back to the whole morality thing.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
So yeah, so it's interesting. So one of the biggest problems that I have, like, stems from the Bible itself, right?
Okay.
So 1 John 4 says that God is love.
Sure.
1 Corinthians 13 defines love biblically as like kind, the thing everybody hears at every wedding, right? Love is not kind,
Patient, love is kind. Yeah.
love is not boastful, blah, 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 blah,
Mhm.
all those things. And yet that, to me, is irreconcilable with the instances that you see, like, in not only just in the Bible, but what we see now, right?
Mhm.
The Bible says that everything, I think it's Ephesians 1:11, says everything is done for his purpose.
Correct. Yep.
And that,
According to the counsel of his own will.
yeah, that he gets what he wants,
Yep.
right? Bible says that he wants no one to perish, that he wants everyone to come to an understanding and relationship and love with him and stuff like that. It just seems like the God of the Bible is puny and almost impotent in this way, because and downright evil, right? Because we see instances like, just looking outside at the world, right?
Mhm.
The
Such
idea
as?
of God being love, right? And the
Right.
biblical definition of being kind and patient is irreconcilable with the world that we see today.
Not necessarily.
Granted, from my perspective. And then the idea that everything's done for his will, so everything that has ever happened, right? Are you a Calvinist?
Yeah, that's what it means to be reformed. Calvinism is a view of soteriology,
Right.
specifically.
Well, I think it also branches into eschatology as well. But yeah, no, okay. So like, it's already written.
Mhm.
Right? So all the suffering that's ever happened, right? Everything's done for his purpose.
Yeah.
All the suffering that's ever happened. This is irreconcilable with a God of love.
No, it's not.
Again, I say from my perspective, it's one
Yeah.
of the, like, the problem of evil is, I don't know, and I've talked about this with a lot of people. I'm still on the fence about this. I don't know if there's a logical problem of evil. if you step inside a biblical worldview.
Right.
But there is an evidential problem of evil, regardless of the perspective you stand and look at it from, at least from my perspective.
I mean, if you're outside of a biblical perspective, a definition of evil becomes meaningless.
No,
at a certain position.
No,
Sure, it does. Because what you see as good and maximizing well-being, somebody else could just as easily see that as minimizing well-being, right? So for the psychopath who wants to kill unrepentantly and is surprised that you have a problem with it,
right.
to put that person in jail or to put that person to death for murder would certainly reduce his well-being to next to, if not zero, once that switch is flipped. Or
it reduces his well-being, right? But from the social contract perspective that I talked about before, it absolutely works out just fine. And that psycho, like as a social contract, kind of like people have decided, right? As people came together, like from my perspective, as people evolved and came together and they started to and we see this with our animal groups as well, right? Like you see this with apes, right? Chimpanzees, for example, they do not tolerate things like theft or things like that within their social groups. They will ban individuals from their groups for these things, right? These animals, right, that don't have morality, they will ban other members of their community for these bad actions. So we come together in these social communities, right? And we understand that the greatest well-being is to, like, I'm against the death penalty personally. So like I would not advocate for the execution of that psychopath who did evil, right? Best example of that is there's a guy, anybody can look this up. His name is Paul Bernardo. He was somewhat infamously known in this area as the Scarborough Rapist. He killed a bunch of women, did horrible things. We don't have the death penalty in Canada. A life sentence in Canada is 25 years in prison. When his sentence was coming up close to it, basically he was found to be a dangerous offender, and he has been imprisoned forever. He will never see the light of day, but he will not be executed. Execution, one, we know too many innocent people that have been executed. Two, we know it's not a deterrent, and those are the two main reasons why I'm against it. But to do the most well-being for society, we exclude these people from being involved in it, right? So from a well-being perspective, yes, I am minimizing that individual's well-being, but it's not just about you and me, right? It's about the entire social group. So like I said before, I have to give a shit about you, have to give a shit about me. But you also have to care about your neighbor and their neighbor and so on. And so do I, right? And so we look at it, we have to take a 30,000-foot view. It can't just be zoomed in and said, I can't put you in prison. That's minimizing your well-being. I guess you can just go off and do what you want. No, we take a 30,000-foot view and say, as a whole, yes, we are minimizing your well-being and infringing on your free will, and is for the betterment of everybody concerned. So I can absolutely do what it is a minute ago you said I can't do. Which is give an account for why, like, morality and doing evil and stuff like that. Like, I absolutely can.
Yeah, and I mean, then there's problems of scope, right? As far as you mentioned, the social group. It's your social group, your community, your city, your country, or territory, I think is what you call them in province. Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Oh, no, you did get one right. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Northwest Territory, that's a thing.
Northwest Yukon and none of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, territories, province. So, how big is the social group that you're talking about? Is it nation? Is it continent? Is it a family of nations, right? Something like a treaty of NATO or something, something like that. So depends on, the scope that you're looking at as opposed to.
Well, not to sound too grandiose, but for me, it branches out to humanity itself, right?
Right.
It's like I care more about my family than I care about, so I care less about my close friends than I care about my immediate family. I care a little bit less about my acquaintances. I care a little bit less about my neighbors. Blah, blah,
concentric
blah,
circles,
right? And it goes out from there, right? But but when we look at kind of like a citizen of humanity, and it's like I have solar panels on my roof. I drive an electric car. I try to minimize my carbon footprint, except when it comes to bacon, and things like this. But, so from a global perspective, it kind of fans out to varying degrees and in varying ways.
Mhm.
Right. And this is how, and I try to think about, my impact on others in most things that I do. Some things I'm not able to. And with the work that I do, sometimes I have to act in contrast, right, to those types of things. So it can be a difficult thing, but it's not. I'm not limited in any way. Like, again, going back to it, me adding God into this wouldn't change the way I act from a moral perspective.
Well, sure it would, because your view of morality, your understanding of goodness would be radically different.
Based on what I just told you, what do you think I would do differently?
Well, I mean, you would not base well-being purely in humanistic terms, or for lack of a better way to say it.
No, I look at it from the well-being of conscious creatures, not just humans.
Okay, all right, there you go. So conscious creatures. So a biblical morality would recognize at the beginning that humanity is step above all other creatures, all other aspects of creation. Well, a little lower than the angels, but as far as what we see on the earth, right? That man is the apex of creation in that regard, made in his image. We're unique in that way. So there's one aspect that would be radically different.
You look at that as actually a downfall, right? Like, that's kind of elitist.
Well, of course you would, right? Because you've already, rejected God a priori from this moral reasoning.
But from your perspective, I know some animals that are smarter than some people I know.
Well, I mean, you can say that, but smart is not really what we're looking at as far as moral value either. Right.
No,
so if we want to try to weigh them,
it can affect how you treat them.
It can, not that it should, right? I mean, because if we're all worthy of value and dignity, then.
But you don't think we're all worthy of value and dignity? There's a tier system for you.
We all have value and dignity because we're made in the image of God.
There's a tier system for you.
What's the tier system that
you just said? We're up here. Everything else is below.
Well, as far as creation is concerned, yeah. So humanity, right? Humanity being made in the image of God. So me, you, everybody watching this, all of the people, right? So pigs under us, chimpanzees
bacon's delicious. Yeah, we agreed on that. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, there's no sense in people that talk about having fur babies, right? You don't have a fur baby, you have a pet, right? A dog is not the same as a kid. I understand.
My wife would poke you in the eye if she heard you say that.
I know, and I know a lot of people that would agree with me theologically would also take umbrage to that particular statement. The fact is, there's no justification for elevating the worth of any animal to equal that of any human being.
Why?
That's because people are made in the image of God. There's something special about being made in the image of God, about being that special creation of God that distinguishes us from the animals. And when we fail to see that, we're getting our understanding of creation upside down. We're exchanging the truth of God for a lie, and we're suppressing that truth in our unrighteousness.
Okay. So I understand. Like, what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to run a little experiment with me. Okay. I am able to do an internal critique and step inside your worldview and understand why it is you said what you said. I would like you to now return that favor and tell me how my worldview is inferior to yours from my perspective.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about your particular morality, right? There's no, shall we say, not ought the word, imperative. You have to do it a particular way. No, you set you set 3 conditions: promoting well-being to the best of our knowledge, right, or to the best of our understanding, to the best of our ability. Eliminating harm, eliminating involuntary imposition of our will onto other conscious creatures.
To the best of our abilities,
right? So when we say something like to the best of our ability,
Right.
well, what ability do we really have?
Well,
right?
the example I gave was vaccinations.
Sure. Well, does that include COVID vaccinations? Are all
Absolutely.
vaccinations created equal?
Absolutely.
I don't know about that.
I've got 6 on board and I'm just fine.
Yeah.
That was a joke, everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, yeah, I'm 6 vaccines deep in the COVID stuff.
But I'm just saying, like, it's easy to say that we know what promotes well-being, but it's different when the rubber meets the road in experience, and we're trying
but these
to.
things are mappable, right? Like these things are just trackable. We understand, right? Like there's a reason why polio wasn't a thing for a long time.
Sure.
And there's a
I'm
reason
not talking about just vaccines.
There's a reason why it's coming back.
So,
because people are being dumb. And they're not vaccinated. They're not vaccinating themselves or their children, right? Like these things are just easily mappable. Like we know these things.
Yeah, and you mentioned love, and that's a very important category from a biblical perspective. But non-biblical, non-Christian understandings of love reveal themselves inconsistently, right? To say that love,
how?
For example, if you have a child, right, who grows up, and we're going to say, becomes of age, because we're talking about, we don't want to talk about kiddos like that, but
like an adult, so like in Canada, years of age.
Okay. But your own progeny that decides to pursue homosexual lifestyle, right? So that's in evolutionary terms, that's a separation between you and the next generations.
Sure, right? It is.
That's a cutoffness, and one could rightly see that, even from your perspective, as morally wrong.
I don't see it as morally wrong, and my daughter is not kind of conforming.
Okay, so, but in your worldview, there's nothing that dictates how you should respond. You have your particular response.
There absolutely is. There absolutely is.
No, okay. So what's that response? What should the response be?
With love, compassion, and understanding.
What do you mean by love?
Like not caring that my daughter doesn't choose to live her life as a strictly heterosexual individual.
So a lack of care in an aspect of your daughter's life is an example of love.
When I say not care, I mean not being judgmental.
Okay. Well, those are two very big, very different.
No, like when I say not caring, I mean it's like it doesn't matter to me, right? Like I've had other people come out to me and say, like, come out to me, be like, sure, I don't care. I don't care what you are.
I've had the same experience, but when you say non-judgmental, that's also kind of a misuse of the term, because when you accept it, you're judging it as right to a degree.
No, I'm saying it's not wrong. There's a difference.
Okay. Well, okay. So
the difference between someone being found guilty versus not guilty. You're not saying the person's innocent. Right. You're saying they're not guilty.
Okay. Fair enough. But it's still a judgment, right? So you're not being non-judgmental.
If you're saying,
you're not judging it negatively, right? And that's one aspect of it.
That's fair.
But see, even in the way we understand and articulate it, it's inconsistent with it.
What's inconsistent? I don't understand.
The way you describe it is non-judgmental, right? It's not actually non-judgmental. It's a different form of judgment that you're applying a term to.
But you understand that, but you understand that words are polysemous, right? Like they can have more than one meaning, right? So when I say judgmental, like instead of saying it's not conform, or it's not, a certain way, you should ask me what I mean when I say non-judgmental, right? Because if I said to you, what does it mean to be sick? Well, someone would say, oh, it means to be not physically well. But if I, if I was to talk to, a kid, is like, oh man, it's sick. It's amazing.
Sure.
Right. Words are polysemous.
Yeah. But
so when I say non-judgmental, I am meaning, being accepting, not excluding them, still showing them love and affection, not telling them that they're wrong or misguided or sinful or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And But my point is, on your worldview, you don't have to respond that way. That's not an ought from your perspective. Somebody could respond in a way that you would see as judgmental.
I'm not sure you can get this thing that, you know, kind of oughts from is, I mean, it's just
Mhm.
it is. So like, for example, with my daughter, it is the way she is. Right. So I
Well, yeah,
actually,
I mean, we behave the way we behave.
I actually think you can get an ought from that. Right. So because her, and putting it under my kind of lens of like how I judge morality, so well-being, harm reduction, things like that. So because nothing she is doing by simply living her life is harmful in any way, shape, or form to another person.
To the best of your knowledge. And
It
that
doesn't
knowledge
have
is
the capacity.
admittedly limited.
She doesn't have so for example, if you like being attracted to the same sex,
Mhm.
right? Even if you, let's say you don't ever act on that, it doesn't have the capacity to be harmful to another human. It
Sure
doesn't.
does. I mean, you
If
disagree.
I was gay and I never acted upon that in any way, shape, or form, I would not have the capacity to have a negative influence on someone
Oh,
else's
okay.
life.
If you didn't act on it, yeah,
Yeah.
my mistake. Okay.
Right. So because what she, you know, how she is doesn't impact anybody else's life in a negative way, right? It doesn't reduce anyone's well-being. It doesn't promote suffering in any way, shape, or form. She's not imposing her will on any other individual. What is she like? There's nothing that she, and so I'm gauging what she is doing versus not doing or anything else like that.
Mhm.
I'm looking at it through my moral lens, and I can absolutely come to a judgment about it.
Well, you can, but what I'm saying is that conclusion is not a necessity based on your general worldview. Right?
I don't know what you mean by that. Can you flush that
Yeah.
out?
So when you respond with what you call love and non-judgmental compassion, like all of that, somebody who believes the same thing you do about morality or the same basic idea, general promotion of well-being, eliminating harm, eliminating involuntary imposition of our will unto conscious creatures, they can come to a different way to demonstrate what they see as love. They can respond differently in a way that you would actually see as negative. But from their perspective, if they are promoting that person's well-being or their family's well-being, I want grandkids, right? That they're promoting well-being of those outside their own circle, right? Eliminating harm. Listen, raising you was one of the joys of my life. I want you to experience that, and if you don't, you're taking something away from your life potentially, right? So I mean, so by contrast, eliminating harm, encouraging somebody to have those experiences, but also not saying that your kid has to, right? You're still eliminating the involuntary. So
Right.
all that to say, your worldview, generally speaking, lacks two things. That's
Well,
a
yeah,
definite moral imperative and moral guardrails to prevent error.
I'm not sure what you mean by moral imperative. Let's put it some time of attacking that for just a second.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the direct example you gave about wanting grandchildren, for example, well, I mean, we haven't really talked about this. I mean, she's talked recently about maybe wanting to get into a relationship now, whatever. I don't care either way. She can do what she wants. It's her life. But if she was to decide in 5 years, you know what? I'm good on my own, but I really want to have a kid. I mean, she can get artificially inseminated and give me a grandkid.
But and so that comes with its own moral judgment. Somebody else could look at that, even with your atheistic worldview generally, and say, look, if you're going to raise a kid, statistics show got to have a mother and father in the home for it to be optimal for that child, right? So now you're promoting the well-being of the offspring.
What
right?
statistic is that? Can you cite that?
Yeah, children do better. I don't know exactly the statistics. Let me back up and say I can't cite it specifically. But generally speaking, sociological studies will show that kids do better with mom and dad both in the home, or at least below that, a mother and a father figure. So stable couple, and then below that, it's a mixed bag.
Well, unfortunately, this is something I have a little bit of expertise in, and it's just not the case. There are lots of examples of situations where, for example, in my work, I have been unfortunately privy to children
Mhm.
who were far better without one of their parents in their lives. And we're talking about heterosexual couples.
Well, sure.
So
Well, if we're
there's
talking about abusive addicts and things like that,
there's lots of examples that would demonstrate what you just said isn't necessarily the case.
so let me clarify. We're talking like stable. So like if you've got an abusive parent, that's not going to apply. If you've got an addict for a parent who's abandoning and spending the rent money at the casinos or on booze, that doesn't apply.
There's no evidence whatsoever
intention-
to show that. There's no evidence whatsoever to show from a longitudinal perspective that single parent or same-sex parent homes yield anything less on a social thriving scale.
If you're again, it comes back to what's your understanding of well-being. Well, if you've weighted the scales there on what constitutes well-being, what constitutes harm, then of course you can include whatever you want to justify the conclusions. And I mean, we can go back and forth on that, but I'm just all that to say, somebody who's looking at a different scope, right? So just generally, we talked about that before, the scope of well-being that you're looking at. Somebody looking at a different scope or a different aspect of it doesn't necessarily need to come to your conclusion, right? So that's what I mean by there's.
I mean,
there's
if somebody
not
if somebody says, wow, I really love my kid, and they beat the snot out of them all the time, even though they're saying they really love their kid, I don't know what they're talking about, right?
Agreed.
I mean, it's borne out more in actions, right? So actions leading to the promotion of well-being and reduction of harm and suffering, promoting well-being, right?
Right.
And reducing the unnecessary imposition of will. So, I mean, if people adopt that foundation and act outside of that foundation, I don't know what to say to that. Like they're saying red and they're talking blue.
Well, so what I mean is they can agree with you in principle to promote well-being, but have a different understanding of what well-being actually is. They can agree with you in principle to eliminate harm, but they can have a different understanding of what constitutes harm.
There are some guidelines, some fairly universal guidelines, right, that we can use as a barometer, right? Whether we talk about, making sure the child's nutrition is properly addressed, making sure that they are dressed appropriately for the climate that they live in, making sure that they're getting the proper education they need, making sure they're taken care of from a medical perspective, right? There are certain universals that we can draw kind of a barometer and say, these are the kind of the minimums of these types of things. Outside of that, do you put the kid to bed at 8:00 at night or let them stay up till 9:30 to watch their favorite TV show? Do you let them, play an hour's worth of video games only on Saturdays and Sundays, or you let them do it if made sure they finish their homework and getting all straight A's? Like there's a bunch of other parameters that you can throw into this that will be vastly different, but still maintaining that bar, that kind of guideline. And so when somebody says that they adhere to the same types of moral principles that I do, well, we can also just gauge how it is they live out that life. Anybody can say anything. I could say I'm a fundamentalist Christian right now. That doesn't mean that it's true. It's depending how I'm living my life, right? So we have to gauge it on what it is the person actually does and how it is their life bears out, their statements and their commitments.
Well, and that kind of gets back into my main objection or my main critique of morality from a more naturalistic perspective is that gray area is enormous to the point of that there are plenty of people now, any walk of life, that believe their role as a parent is to let their child be whatever they want to be. And there are a lot of people who believe that their role as a parent is to guide their child and help develop them intellectually, morally, and even spiritually, although not necessarily from an atheistic perspective, but certainly from a non-Christian perspective, right? So two different ideas of parenting, but all all of those in that entire spectrum fits comfortably under this idea of promoting well-being and reducing harm.
Right. Yeah. But again, we can still go back to those same kind of universals, right? So you can take someone who you can take two kids, one kid raised, in a completely secular way, and another kid raised in a fundamentalist Christian kind of way. And as long as you're meeting all those same standards, right? Health, welfare, food, education, all these other types of things, and you take and you raise them up to this same age, and then throw them out into the world, right? They're going to be able to operate from the same, or hopefully from the same levels. Right. So again, I think adding a spiritual side to that is again superfluous, right? Like it doesn't, it's like if I, I did the best to raise, my daughter, teaching her right from wrong. I'm fairly certain she hasn't bludgeoned anyone to death, right? And so
she's got one commandment down, so she's 10% of the way there.
Yeah. But I certainly never would have taught her, that she has to, gesticulate to a, entity in the sky. Because that doesn't add anything to the equation, right? Like what does not having any God before me add to morality? From a tangible perspective.
When you say tangible,
in an impactful way, practical way.
I mean, it adds humility, right? If I recognize that I'm not God, for example, right? If I don't try to put myself on that throne, then I don't get to determine right and wrong. So even if I have this desire to, literally kill the guy that just cut me off in traffic, I can't do that, right? Because I'm not the arbiter of life and death. I don't get to make that decision. Even if I've got a screw loose in my head, where, if I am a psychopath and I think, well, this is what I want, by golly, this is what I'm going to go for, right? Just because I want it doesn't make it right. Just because I believe I'm the arbiter of life and death, or that I can decide whether that person lives or dies, doesn't ascribe that authority to me, right? Just because in other words, just because I have the power doesn't mean I have the authority. So recognizing that first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, that is recognizing our place in the world. It is ordering our perspective rightly in relation to reality.
Okay. So then, now what I want you to do is plug God out of your head, plug my moral philosophy into your head for just a moment from an internal perspective. Tell me why I can't do the same thing.
Tell me why. Ultimately, it's dependent upon your own understanding.
Yeah. Tell me what, what would make me more likely to bludgeon the person to death who cut me off in traffic?
I mean,
because I don't believe in God, right? Like, in fact, like I take the stronger stance. I believe gods are mythical, completely man-made fiction. Okay. Why, and yet I would see murdering that person who cut me off in traffic a moral abomination.
You say that now, but
I've been cut off in traffic before.
No, I know, or I don't know that. I don't doubt it, rather. But when your morality is based ultimately upon your own perspective, right? Your understanding of well-being, your understanding of harm,
right?
And to the best of your ability, it's limited by you as well. You're effectively making yourself the arbiter of morality, at least in your own sphere, and you apply that to all the concentric spheres or around that, right? From your immediate family on outward, because it's based on your own understanding and your own ability to do these things.
Right.
So if your particular ability change, or your particular desires change,
from one perspective,
you could act differently, and it's still consistent with your overall goal of morality. So if your understanding of well-being changes, if your understanding of harm changes, even if it's momentary, in that moment, you could make that decision and then move on.
I mean, it's
And there was
entirely
no conflict within your worldview. There
something
is a
can split.
conflict 100% of the time in a biblical worldview.
So could I snap? Sure, but so could you, right? There's nothing that, like, believing in God doesn't make it impossible for you to have a psychological break.
But the difference there, though, is you're right. We could both have that similar thing. The difference is if I snapped, I'm acting in contrast to my moral principles, and in contrast to the moral principles. No, because if you snap, your understanding changes. So your moral perspective has changed, and therefore you're still consistent with it.
I don't think you understand. Like, so if someone has a psychological break, that is a break from their normal actions, right? It's not
normal actions.
It's not.
But your overall principles are the same, right?
Right. So when someone
because you're talking about well-being and harm.
When someone has a psychological break, they don't sit there and go, you know what? I know this is wrong, but fuck it. That doesn't happen, right? That they have a psychological break, right? And so but what you said is partially correct, right? To steal another line from Ricky Gervais, I have killed as many people as I want to kill. It just so happens that number is 0.
Right.
Right. I have slept with as many other women outside of my marriage as I want to. That number is 0. I steal as much as I want to. That number is 0. Right? Acting within my moral framework. But when someone has a break, there is, I don't know how, it would be really something if you could demonstrate this. I don't know how you can say that someone who has a belief in God and has a moral break has a different biochemical reaction in their brain than someone who doesn't believe in God and has a psychological break and does something abhorrent.
I don't think I quite followed the whole process there.
So 2 people, right? An atheist and a Christian.
Right.
They're both cut off. They're in separate parts of the world. They're both cut off in traffic at exactly the same time. They both have a psychological break and do something they wouldn't have done. Okay. What's different about the Christian?
The morality that's broken there is a fixed point, right? It's a fixed point
for me too.
It's not, because it's based on your understanding, and that understanding is constantly changing.
Breaking this down to the lowest common denominator. For me, it is a fixed point.
It's not a fixed point though, because we're always changing, right?
I'm sorry, but you don't have access to my private mental thoughts. I'm
not saying I understand your mental thoughts.
I'm telling you what I would or wouldn't do. I am not going to I'm not going to hurt that person absent having a psychological break. Having a psychological break, the Christian is going to be in as much control of their faculties as an atheist would be.
So I guess one way to look at it is a recognition that the moral standard is unchanging. So even if
my moral standard doesn't change, I still believe that it's wrong.
And you've had this understanding your entire life. Everything you understand about morality.
I think as I started to, when I started thinking about it, I think we all go through varying degrees of awareness, like personal psychological awareness. But when I came to the state where I guess I am now, yes, I have always believed that bludgeoning someone to death is a really bad thing.
That's good, right? I think we can agree that bludgeoning someone to death is not good. But I mean, just generally, your understanding of morality.
So I hate to jump in again. So we've had a few comments and chats, and I think we're kind of spinning wheels here a little bit.
Might be a little bit. We've also been going for 2 hours and 20 minutes. So.
I have noticed that as well. You guys are free to, at your leisure, say, "Hey, I have to go," and we can cut it off at any point. I'm just here for the ride. As I told Canadian Atheist when he was going to jump on the show was his. So, if Wes, you need to leave, let him know, and then I'll wrap things up. If you need to leave,
I haven't had the benefit of having dinner yet. I'm getting a little hangry. But Wes, this has been such an amazing conversation, and I've really enjoyed the back and forth. I think it necessitates, if our hosts are willing, a round two, right? Where maybe we try to, and because we bounced around, which is probably my fault, so much, maybe if we tried to pick something to hone in on a little bit more, and then dedicated some time to talking about a very specific subject.
I'm good with that.
Assad, Trib, you guys, how does that sound to you guys?
Absolutely fine with that. We are more than welcome to have you back on, both of you. I think both of you, I mean, neither of you have outworn your welcome. So you are more than
well, like
welcome
your
to come
guest
back
last
on.
week, eh? That was funny.
So if he wants to come back on for a formal debate, I will have him on. For
Can I moderate that?
I prefer not to go by Trib though.
Oh,
Triple A. I don't know if you know what that means.
Well, let's not. Hey, for the audience, please don't Google it.
Okay. Triple A, I apologize.
Nonetheless, with that in mind, I think it's been a fantastic conversation back and forth. Even though the name is now Let's Debatable, as our viewers are aware, we like to have an open and kind of free-flowing discussion, and I think that's what we've had today, and a good one nonetheless. And since our lovely stand-in host, Canadian Atheist, hasn't had time to eat, and we're kind of at an almost at an impasse here. If it's okay with everybody, I'm more than happy to have us set up a round two, and we can continue it from there. I apologize for the weird middle stop streaming issue. Don't know what happened there.
That's all right. This was the part two.
This is semi part two. We'll have a part 2A in the future. But I did want to thank both of you for coming on. I think we're kind of at that point where we're spinning wheels, and I think everybody's just 2.5 hours in, what we can call it. We're all welcome to come back on.
Yeah. How was the? I never open stream. I never look at things like that. How was the side chat? Was it lively, or are there any other questions?
One of my good buddies, his name is Jesse, and he's been in the chat pretty much the whole time. He asked a lot of questions, primarily directed at Wes. I was addressing some of those for my personal thing because Wes and I had a really long discussion last time, and we've also addressed some of the questions that Jesse was talking about. Primarily went into the talking about morality and physical harm. Basically, how can harm be harm if it's not physical, given that everything we know about the brain and how it processes things are physical processes. The other thing is the is-ought problem, which is something that I think both we've addressed multiple times. And Canadian Atheists, maybe we can have a private conversation about how observing things like well-being in the universe as a action of consequences can be a objective standard, even absent of your own personal mind. But for Wes, the is-ought problem still relies on, even if there is a God, why should I care what he wants and why should I do what he wants? You know, the is-ought is always going to be there. Hume has unfortunately nailed it. There's even if there is a God, why should I care at all what he says, or and I think ultimately that's where well-being comes into play. And that's I'll go as far as saying that I don't even think the solution isn't that it hasn't even been discovered yet. I don't think there is a solution. If you were to put the is-ought problem within a syllogism, you see it just becomes a non sequitur. A value has to be in the premise. So we talk about let's say killing is wrong. You kill somebody, so you did something wrong, but there's no ought. That ought has to be in the premise. You can't put that ought in the conclusion. You can't say killing is wrong, and so you should not kill someone. There has to be a value that is built into the premise. So it can't be intrinsic. It violates logic.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I don't think this can be solved.
Yeah, not to interrupt you, but you said something really interesting that made me remember something from, I think, the last discussion where Justin and Wes were both here. And it made me think about it, and it made a lot of sense. The idea of objective moral values and duties is completely contradictory.
It is.
Because
values are inherently subjective.
Yeah. So it was, and it was interesting because I remember having watched like Christopher Hitchens speak with William Lane Craig and stuff like that, and that's something that Craig always goes to, right? Objective moral values and duties, and I'm like, it was actually I credit you with it because you were the one that made me look at it differently and go, fuck, that's not a thing, like it can't be a thing, right? In order for it to be a value, it's got to be coming from someone.
Mm-hmm.
Because that psychopath values harming the other person.
Right.
It's got to come from someone.
Right.
And so thank you for illuminating me in that way.
Appreciate it, man.
Also, welcome to the conversation. Good to have you.
Show, which I will do my best not to interrupt on. Although if I give my 2 cents on where you can find a copy of the Audible Bible read by Morgan Freeman, I apologize. So last word of the show, guest?
I wouldn't want an Audible Bible read by Morgan Freeman. I'd want it read by James Earl Jones because he does Darth Vader's voice.
Oh,
that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
I would have loved it in Christopher Hitchens' voice. I could listen to him talk forever.
Yes.
I loved hearing him speak.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, listen, guys, thank you so much for the opportunity and for the conversation. I think it was great. I think we got to, at the end point, precisely where we thought it was going to be, which was non-agreement. But I think what it shows here, and this is something I like to say to people that will come back and view streams of conversations that I have. So for everybody watching this, and we'll watch it in the future, what you just witnessed was two people who are diametrically opposed from a worldview perspective, and they still behave like decent human beings. And so if we can strive for that more in our discourse, everybody wins.
Yep.
I'll
Thanks.
take my example.
100%. And I'll echo gratitude to AAA and Facade for having us on. I've enjoyed making this a regular stop over the last few months, and I look forward to doing it again. Michael, it was great to meet you. One thing I really appreciate, and I didn't say this earlier, and I want to make sure I say it, is from the outset, it's obvious to me that you take this seriously in the way you conduct yourself and the way you prepare. And so I appreciate that. You come to the table with an earnest desire for truth, but like you said, a willingness to dialogue with somebody you're diametrically opposed to. And I love conversations like this. I often find myself more comfortable in conversations like this because if we can be honest about where we disagree, then when we find elements of agreement, it's almost that much sweeter in that respect. So I appreciate you taking the time. It was very nice to meet you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation on this platform, on yours, what have you. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention the gospel at some point in our conversation. But for those watching, I would encourage you to read the Bible, specifically look at who Christ was and who Christ is, what he did, his life, death, and resurrection. Trust in him for your salvation. You will find him to be a perfect Savior. I don't care what these three jokers say. But I love you guys. I appreciate it. Glad, again, for the opportunity.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, and whether we do it on our podcast or back here again, like I said, AAA, I will never call you the other name again.
Just Google it.
Google it.
Make sure there's no kids around.
Yeah,
just
don't
definitely.
Would that be morally bad if you did? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, definitely want to have you guys on the.
The answer to that is yes. It would be morally bad if you did that in front of kids. Don't.
Definitely want to have you guys on the podcast. And Wes, if you're talking to Justin, the two of you as well. I think it would be. I think it's a great conversation. I don't like the mental masturbation of always talking to people you agree with. I think you're going to learn way more when you talk to people you have disagreements with.
Agreed.
I think I think a better term would be circle jerk, but there's more people involved.
It is a square, not a circle. Come on, we're in a square.
Okay.
Whole purpose of the show. Well, thank you guys both for coming on. I don't know if we have anyone next week. I'm terrible at this. I usually just do the technical stuff. I don't do.
We got Justin next week actually.
Oh, okay. We have Justin next week. All right, so we'll see Justin solo next week minus Wes. Just like I had Wes this week. But